The laughter hit me before the words fully landed, sharp and careless, bouncing off the walls of the year-end party, as my son smirked and said it out loud for everyone to hear, asking when I would ever own a lakeside house like her dad, as if my worth could be measured by waterfront property and public embarrassment. I stood there with a drink in my hand, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation, not just from the insult, but from the betrayal of hearing it. Come from my own child, while his wife watched closely, her smile small, satisfied, and perfectly timed. In that moment I realized this was never just a joke, it was a performance, a deliberate attempt to put me in my place, to remind me where they believed I belonged, beneath them, beneath her family, beneath the life they wanted to project. The room fed on it, laughter, spreading heads, turning eyes, judging, waiting to see if I would shrink the way they expected. What none of them knew was that I had stayed quiet for a long time, for a reason not out of weakness, but patience. Every insult, every comparison, every careless dismissal had been quietly stored away, building toward a moment they never prepared for. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not defend myself the way they assumed I would. I simply spoke the truth they had overlooked, the one detail that turned laughter into silence and confidence into fear. If you stay with me to the end, you will see how one sentence dismantled their pride, exposed their arrogance, and delivered a revenge far more satisfying than anger ever could. My name is Charles Morgan. I'm 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges across the American West. I built structures designed to last 100 years, and I believed I had built a family the same way. I was wrong about one of those things. The year-end party was Melissa's idea, though she made it sound like Daniel's. She had a talent for that, my daughter-in-law, for making her desires appear as someone else's generosity. The invitation arrived 3 weeks before Christmas, printed on cream-colored cardstock, with gold embossing, the kind of stationery that whispers money before you even read the words. A celebration of family and the year's blessings, it said. What it meant was something else entirely. I drove 2 hours from the Lakeside cabin to Daniel's house in the suburbs, a sprawling modern construction of glass and sharp angles that Margaret had never liked. She used to say it looked like a building that didn't know how to relax. I pulled into the driveway behind a row of luxury cars, my 15-year-old pickup truck looking like an uninvited guest among them. I didn't mind. I had long stopped measuring my worth by what I drove. Inside, the house gleamed with holiday excess. A 12-foot tree dominated the living room, professionally decorated in silver and white. Catering staff circulated with champagne flutes and artfully arranged appetizers. 30 or 40 guests filled the space, most of them from Melissa's side of the family, their laughter sharp-edged and performative. Thomas Whitmore held court near the fireplace. Melissa's father was a large man, 70 years old, but carrying himself like someone who expected the world to make room for him. He was telling a story about a recent real estate acquisition, his voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. $3 million for the land alone, he said, pausing for effect. But when you understand value, you don't hesitate. The small crowd around him nodded appreciatively. I noticed his watch caught the light, with every gesture a conscious display. I found a quiet corner near the window and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Daniel spotted me from across the room and made his way over, Melissa trailing behind him with her camera-ready smile. My son had his mother's eyes, but none of her warmth. Somewhere along the way, he had learned to look at people the way investors look at portfolios. "Dad, glad you could make it." He said the words perfectly cordial and perfectly empty. "Thomas was just talking about his new development project. You should come listen." "I'm fine here," I said. "It's a lovely party." Melissa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "We wanted everyone to see how blessed we've been this year. Family is so important." She emphasized the word family as though it were a vocabulary lesson for a slow student. Later, after dinner, Thomas gathered everyone for what he called a moment of gratitude. He raised his glass and began listing his achievements of the year: the properties acquired, the investments multiplied, the legacy being built. When he finished, he turned his gaze toward me. "Charles," he said, "what about you? What are you grateful for this year?" Before I could answer, Daniel spoke up. "Dad's still got his little lakeside cabin." He chuckled, glancing at Melissa for approval. "Some people just don't understand real success. They think small and stay small." The room laughed politely. Melissa's laugh was the loudest. Thomas smiled, but his eyes stayed fixed on mine. "Margaret," he said slowly. She must have had a good life with you. How fortunate. The word hung in the air, weighted with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't a compliment. It was a question disguised as one, or perhaps an accusation dressed as nostalgia. I watched his face as he said my wife's name. There was familiarity there, and something older, something that tasted like unfinished business. He knew her, I realized, not casually, not through family gatherings and holiday cards. He knew her from before, from a time I had never been told about. I said nothing. I simply nodded, raised my glass slightly, and took a sip of water. They expected anger. They expected embarrassment, perhaps a stammered defense or a quiet retreat to the corner. They had prepared for weakness because weakness was all they understood. But I was no longer listening to their words. I was reading their faces the way Margaret taught me years ago when we used to play cards with neighbors. Watch the eyes, she would say. The mouth lies, but the eyes confess. Thomas's eyes confessed something that night. So did Melissa's. So did Daniel's, though his confession was different, sadder, more complicated. What I saw behind their arrogance was fear. Fear that the game they were playing might not end the way they expected. Fear that the old man in the corner might not be as simple as he appeared. They were right to be afraid. They just didn't know it yet. I drove home that night through empty highways, the party's laughter still echoing in my ears like a song played in the wrong key. The truck's headlights carved through darkness, and I found myself thinking about Margaret, the way I always did when the world felt particularly unkind. She had been gone 3 years now, but some absences never stop feeling fresh. They just become part of the architecture of your days, a room you learn to walk around but never quite forget is there. The cabin appeared through the trees just after midnight, its windows dark against the Colorado sky. I had bought this place 40 years ago, back when the land was cheap and the lake was considered too remote for serious investment. Margaret fell in love with it the first time she saw it. She said the water reminded her of patience, how it never rushed, never forced its way, just kept moving until it shaped the stone. I think she was talking about more than water. Inside the house held its breath the way it always did when I returned. I turned on the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the silence. Her presence was everywhere, still not as a ghost, but as a kind of gravity. The garden she had planted outside the window, now dormant for winter, but still holding shape. The shelves lined with her favorite books, dog-eared and annotated in her careful handwriting. The photograph on the nightstand in our bedroom, taken the summer before she got sick. Her smile caught in that moment between laughter and stillness. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared 43 years of morning conversations. The ritual had not changed since her death. I still set out 2 cups sometimes, not from confusion, but from habit, from the unwillingness to let go of small ceremonies. My mind drifted back to Daniel's words at the party, his little lakeside cabin. Some people just don't understand real success. The contempt in his voice had been casual, rehearsed as though he had said it many times before in rooms I was not invited to. I wondered when my son had learned to speak about me that way, when the boy who used to follow me to construction sites had become a man who measured his father in square footage and stock prices. I remembered the day we sold our first home. Daniel was 26, full of ambition and ideas, certain he had found the perfect business opportunity. He needed capital more than a young man could borrow from banks. Margaret and I talked about it for 3 nights, sitting in that same kitchen in our old house, the one with the wraparound porch she had always loved. In the end, we sold it. We gave Daniel everything he needed to start his company, and we moved here to the cabin by the lake. Daniel had hugged me that day, his eyes wet with gratitude. "I'll make you proud," he said. "I promise." Now that promise felt like a receipt for something that was never delivered. The business had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But somewhere in that success, Daniel had lost the part of himself that remembered where it came from. Or perhaps, he simply chose to forget. Forgetting is easier than gratitude, I have learned. Gratitude requires you to stay humble, and humility does not photograph well at year-end parties. Margaret had tried to warn me. I remembered a conversation from years ago, one of those quiet evening talks that seemed unimportant at the time, but grew heavier with age. She had been organizing financial documents, her reading glasses perched on her nose, and she looked up at me with an expression I did not understand then. "Never tell anyone what we really have," she said. "Not even Daniel. Wealth reveals character faster than time. I had laughed thinking she was being dramatic. We were not wealthy people, not by the standards of the Whitmores of the world. We had enough, that was all. Enough to be comfortable enough to help our son when he needed it, enough to live quietly without worry. But Margaret had meant something more, something I was only beginning to understand. After the party, I could not sleep. I found myself in the small room she had used as a study, surrounded by her books and papers. I had not touched most of them since her death, preserving them like artifacts in a museum of grief. But that night I pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk and found a notebook I did not recognize. It was old, the leather cover worn soft with handling, filled with her handwriting and entries spanning decades. I turned the pages slowly, reading fragments of her thoughts, her observations, her quiet record of a life lived with intention. Near the middle of the notebook, I found a page that had been torn out. The ragged edge stood out against the careful order of everything else. On the page before it, a single line caught my attention. Final meeting, it said. Then 2 initials, M.W. I stared at the letters, trying to place them. M.W. The initials meant nothing to me, and yet something about them felt urgent, unfinished, like a question Margaret had left behind, knowing I would eventually need to ask it. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest. The house was silent around me, the lake invisible in the darkness outside. I thought of her voice in the hospital 3 years ago when she was too weak to say much, but strong enough to say what mattered. She had taken my hand and whispered, "Trust what I've prepared for you." I had nodded, then, not knowing what she meant, assuming it was the rambling of a mind softened by medication and exhaustion. I told her I trusted her. I told her I always had. Now, 3 years later, holding her hidden notebook in a house that still smelled faintly of her perfume, I realized she had not been rambling at all. She had been giving me instructions, and I was finally ready to follow them. The days after the party passed slowly, as winter days do in the mountains. I kept Margaret's notebook close, reading through it at night, trying to understand the woman I had loved for 43 years and apparently never fully known. But understanding requires context, and context was something I lacked, so I did what engineers do when faced with incomplete data. I observed, I listened, I began to see patterns I'd been too polite to notice before. Melissa had always been transparent to me, though I had pretended otherwise for Daniel's sake. From the first dinner she attended at our home 7 years ago, I recognized the way she cataloged the room. Her eyes moved across our furniture, our art, our modest dishware, performing calculations I could almost hear. She smiled at Margaret's homemade pie, but did not take a second slice. She complimented the cabin's view, but asked within 20 minutes whether we had ever considered selling. "Waterfront property appreciates beautifully," she said, as though she were offering financial advice rather than appraising our life. Margaret saw it too. After Melissa and Daniel left that night, my wife stood at the sink washing dishes and said quietly, "That one counts everything." I asked what she meant. She just shook her head and handed me a plate to dry. Over the years, Melissa's assessments became less subtle. She would visit with Daniel and mention her father's latest acquisition within the first 10 minutes. "Dad just closed on a development in Aspen," she might say, or "Dad's portfolio manager says this is his best year yet." The message was never spoken directly, but always delivered. Thomas Whitmore was a man of consequence. I was not. Once during a family dinner, she turned to Daniel and said loud enough for me to hear, "My dad built an empire. Your dad built a pension." Daniel laughed uncomfortably and changed the subject, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. The small wound that healed into something harder. Melissa knew how to plant seeds in that way, how to make her comparisons feel like observations rather than attacks. I began to research Thomas Whitmore, not out of malice, but out of the same curiosity that had driven my engineering career. Understand the structure, Margaret used to say, and you understand the stress points. What I found surprised me less than it should have. Thomas had been married 3 times. His first wife, Melissa's mother, left after 12 years, citing irreconcilable differences. Public records and old newspaper clippings told the official story, but the truth lived in smaller details. Each of his subsequent marriages followed the same pattern: a younger woman dazzled by wealth and attention, a few years of visible happiness at charity galas and society events. Then a quiet divorce, always initiated by the wife, always settled quickly with generous terms that ensured silence. The phrase that appeared in one court filing stayed with me: emotional control. The second wife's attorney had used those words, a pattern of emotional control that made genuine partnership impossible. Thomas had taught his daughter well. I remembered something Melissa said to Daniel last Christmas, a comment I had overheard while getting coffee in the kitchen. They didn't know I was listening. "Marriage is investment," she told him, her voice carrying the certainty of inherited wisdom. "Never let emotions cloud your judgment. Dad taught me that. It's why I chose you." Daniel said nothing in response. I wondered then, as I wonder now, whether he understood what she meant, whether he recognized that he had been selected, not loved, chosen for what he represented, not who he was. But it was another comment one Daniel mentioned to me weeks later in a rare moment of confusion that truly caught my attention. He had called to ask about a tax document, and somewhere in the conversation his voice dropped. "Melissa said something strange the other day," he told me. "She said her dad made his biggest mistake when he chose her mom over someone else. When I asked what she meant, she just laughed and said it didn't matter anymore." I didn't press Daniel for more, but I wrote the words down in my own notebook beneath the initials M.W. from Margaret's journal. Someone else. The phrase felt like a key without a lock. The final piece came by accident. I had driven to Daniel's house to drop off Christmas gifts for the grandchildren, but no one answered the door. As I turned to leave, I heard Melissa's voice through an open window, sharp and animated. She was on the phone, pacing the living room. "I know Dad," she said. "I know, but he's stubborn. He won't just hand it over." A pause. Then Thomas's voice, tinny through the speaker, but unmistakable. "Don't rush. Wait for the perfect moment. He'll break eventually. They all do." I stood frozen on the porch, gifts in hand, listening to my daughter-in-law and her father discuss me like a problem to be solved, a strategy to be executed. I left the gifts by the door and drove home in silence. The mountains passed outside my window, ancient and indifferent. I thought about Margaret's notebook, about the initials M.W. and the page that had been torn out, about Thomas Whitmore's 3 failed marriages and his daughter's cold arithmetic. Melissa had a plan. That much was clear now. Thomas had something older, something that felt less like greed and more like grudge. The way he said Margaret's name at the party, the strange weight in his voice when he called her fortunate. And me, I had something neither of them knew about. A wife who kept secrets not out of distrust but out of foresight. A woman who had seen them coming perhaps long before I ever knew there was anything to see. 50 years before they arrived at my door, Margaret had already begun preparing for this moment. I just had to find out what she had left behind. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after I had overheard Melissa and Thomas through the window. Daniel's voice was stiff, overly casual, the way people sound when they are reading from a script they have rehearsed too many times. He asked if he could come by to discuss something important, family business, he called it. I agreed, though I already knew what was coming. The only question was how they would frame it. Daniel arrived alone, or so it appeared. His car pulled into the driveway just after noon, and I watched from the kitchen window as he sat behind the wheel for a long moment, gathering himself. When he finally walked to the door, his shoulders carried a weight I recognized from years of watching men face tasks they did not want to perform. He knocked even though he had a key. That small formality told me everything. I let him in and offered coffee. He declined. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped him with calculus homework, where Margaret had served birthday cakes and holiday meals, where our family had existed before it became something else. Daniel placed a manila folder on the surface between us, his fingers lingering on it, as though he might still change his mind. "Dad," he began, "I've been talking to some financial advisors about your situation." He opened the folder and spread out several documents, official-looking papers dense with legal language. "At your age, it makes sense to think about estate planning. Transferring assets now can avoid complications later. Tax benefits, simplified, probate, that kind of thing." His voice was rehearsed. His eyes avoided mine, focusing instead on the papers, the table, the window behind me. I recognized the performance because I had seen it before in contractors who knew their numbers did not add up, in project managers delivering news they did not believe. I didn't look at the documents. I looked at my son. "Who wrote these?" I asked. He hesitated. "A lawyer Melissa knows. He specializes in this kind of thing." I nodded slowly. Then I pushed the folder back across the table. "No." Daniel blinked. "No, Dad, you haven't even read them." "I don't need to read them," I said. "The answer is no." From the hallway came a sound, a slight intake of breath. Melissa stepped into the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, her presence confirming what I had suspected. She had been listening the entire time, waiting to see if her husband could close the deal alone. "Charles," she said, her voice sharp with practiced patience, "you're being selfish. We're trying to help you. Do you have any idea how complicated things become when elderly parents refuse to plan ahead? The legal fees, the court battles, the stress on the family." I said nothing. I had learned that silence often reveals more than questions. Melissa's composure cracked slightly. "This is for your own good. Daniel has been worried sick about you living out here alone. No one to look after your affairs. We're offering to take that burden off your shoulders." "I appreciate the concern," I said evenly. "But my affairs are my own to manage." Daniel's jaw tightened. Something shifted in his face, a flash of frustration or perhaps shame. When he spoke again, his voice was louder than I had ever heard it directed at me. "Dad, why do you have to make everything so difficult? We're your family. We're trying to protect you, and you're acting like we're the enemy." The words hung in the air between us. My son had never raised his voice to me before. Not once in 45 years. I saw in his eyes the war being fought beneath the surface, the battle between the boy who had once promised to make me proud, and the man who had learned to measure success by his wife's standards. I didn't respond with anger. "Daniel," I said quietly, "when you're ready to talk to me alone, you know where I am." He stood abruptly, gathering the papers with shaking hands. Melissa was already turning away, her heels clicking against the floor as she headed for the door. But as Daniel moved to follow her, I noticed something. His hand went to his pocket fingers, brushing against the outline of his phone, a small gesture, almost unconscious. Then he was gone. I stood at the window and watched them drive away. The car paused at the end of the driveway longer than necessary before turning onto the road. I imagined Daniel sitting there alone with his thoughts replaying the conversation. I imagined him doing what I had seen him do before without understanding it, scrolling through his phone, checking files, carrying evidence of something he had not yet found the courage to confront. My son was trapped. I understood that now with painful clarity. He was not evil, not in the way Thomas and Melissa were evil. He was a man caught between loyalty and love, between the father who raised him and the wife who controlled him. Trapped men are not blameless, but they are not beyond redemption either. They simply need a door to open. But trapped men can also cause harm even unintentionally, and I could not afford to wait for Daniel to find his way out. I needed help. I needed someone who understood what Margaret had prepared, someone who could translate her foresight into action. That night I sat in Margaret's study and opened her address book. The name was still there, written in her careful handwriting. Eleanor Brooks. They had been friends since college, close. In the way women sometimes are sharing secrets they never tell their husbands. Eleanor had become a lawyer specializing in trusts and estates. Margaret always said she was the smartest person she knew. I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang 3 times. Then a voice answered, calm and unsurprised, as though she had been expecting this call for years. "I wondered when you'd call," Eleanor said. "Margaret told me you would, eventually." Eleanor's voice carried the same steady calm I remembered from Margaret's funeral, when she had stood beside me and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She gave me an address in Denver and told me to come the next morning. "No explanations over the phone," she said. "Some truths require eye contact." I arrived at her office just after 9. It occupied the top floor of a modest building downtown, the kind of place that whispered competence rather than shouting wealth. Eleanor met me in the lobby herself, her silver hair pulled back, her handshake firm. She had aged since I last saw her, but her eyes held the same sharpness Margaret always admired. She led me to a conference room with windows overlooking the mountains and closed the door behind us. "Before we begin," she said, settling into a chair across from me, "I need you to understand something. Everything I'm about to tell you, Margaret asked me to keep secret, not from you specifically, but from everyone. She believed secrets were safest when no one knew they existed." I nodded, though my chest tightened. 3 years of grief had not prepared me for more revelations about the woman I thought I knew completely. Eleanor opened a folder on the table between us. Inside were legal documents neatly organized, bearing Margaret's signature on pages I had never seen. "Your wife established a revocable living trust 17 years ago," she said. "The Lakeside cabin, your investment accounts, several properties you may not even know about. None of it is in your name, Charles. It belongs to the trust with you as the primary beneficiary and trustee." I stared at the papers. I don't understand. We filed taxes together. We made financial decisions together. How could I not know? Because Margaret structured it that way, Eleanor said gently. She handled the administrative details through my office. The accounts you saw, the statements you reviewed, those were real, but they represented only part of the picture. The trust holds significantly more managed separately, invested conservatively. Margaret wanted protection, not secrecy for its own sake. She was preparing for something she hoped would never come. Preparing for what? Eleanor hesitated. She removed her glasses and set them on the table, a gesture that felt like preparation for something difficult. Charles, there's something I never told you, something Margaret made me swear to keep until you came asking questions. She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who had rehearsed them many times. Thomas Whitmore proposed to Margaret in 1974, before she met you, before any of this. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the edge of the table. That's not possible. She never mentioned him, not once in 43 years. Because she wanted to forget, Eleanor said. They met at a charity event in Boston. Thomas was already wealthy, already charming, already showing signs of what he would become. He pursued her aggressively, gifts, attention, promises of a life most women would envy, but Margaret saw through it. She told me later that his eyes never matched his smile, that when he talked about their future, he spoke as though she were a property he intended to acquire. I thought of Thomas at the party, the way he said Margaret's name, the weight in his voice, the strange personal hostility I could not explain. She refused him, Eleanor continued, politely at first, then firmly when he wouldn't accept her answer. Thomas Whitmore was not a man accustomed to rejection. He told her she was making the mistake of her life, that she would regret choosing poverty over security. 6 months later, she met you. And Thomas, he never forgot. Some men move past rejection, others let it calcify into something darker. Eleanor leaned forward. When Melissa started dating Daniel, Margaret recognized the name immediately. She investigated quietly, confirmed the connection, and came to me in a panic. She was certain it wasn't coincidence. You're saying Thomas encouraged his daughter to marry my son as some kind of revenge. I'm saying Margaret believed that, and I've come to believe it too. Thomas waited 50 years, Charles. He positioned his daughter inside your family like a surgeon placing a blade. Melissa may think she's acting on her own ambition, but the playbook she's following, the tactics, the patience, those came from her father. I sat in silence, trying to reconcile this information with the life I thought I had lived. Margaret had carried this secret for decades, protecting me from a threat I never knew existed. Why didn't she tell me? I finally asked. Eleanor's expression softened. She wanted to. Many times. But she also knew you, Charles. She knew you would confront Thomas directly, and she believed that would only make things worse. So she prepared instead. The trust, the legal protections, the documentation. She built a fortress around your family's assets and waited to see if it would ever be needed. And you waited too, even after she died. Margaret made me promise, Eleanor said. She told me, if Charles chooses to endure, that's his right. He's a proud man, and proud men sometimes prefer peace over battle. But if he chooses to stand up, if he comes to you asking questions, give him the weapons. Those were her exact words. She trusted your judgment, Charles. She just wanted to make sure you had options. I looked at the documents spread across the table. 17 years of planning. 50 years of grudge. A marriage that was never just a marriage, but an invasion disguised as love. What do they actually want? I asked. Melissa and Thomas, what's the end game? Eleanor closed the folder and met my eyes. Melissa doesn't just want your money, Charles. She wants to destroy everything Margaret built. The trust, the legacy, the life you shared. She wants to erase Margaret's victory and replace it with her own. Because that's what her father has wanted for 50 years. He couldn't have Margaret, so he'll settle for burning down everything she loved. I drove home from Eleanor's office with my hands steady on the wheel, but my mind racing through decades of memories, re-examining them under new light. Every choice Margaret made, every quiet decision I had attributed to modesty or practicality, now revealed itself as strategy. She had been playing a game I never knew existed, protecting us from an enemy I never saw coming. The cabin felt different when I returned. Not emptier, but fuller somehow, dense with meaning I was only beginning to understand. I walked through the rooms, slowly seeing them as Margaret must have seen them. The simple furniture we had chosen together, the lack of ostentation that visitors sometimes mistook for lack of means, the deliberate, careful ordinariness of a life built to avoid attention. She had understood something about wealth that Thomas Whitmore never would. Money was not just currency, it was language, and the way you spoke it revealed everything about who you were. Thomas shouted his wealth from rooftops, wore it on his wrist, drove it down streets where people would notice. He needed others to see his success because without witnesses he was not sure it existed. Margaret had chosen the opposite path. She accumulated quietly, invested patiently, and never once used money to measure herself against another person. I thought about Melissa at family dinners, cataloging our possessions with her eyes. I thought about Thomas at the party, listing his acquisitions like a man reciting prayers. They could not help themselves. Their entire identity depended on comparison, on hierarchy, on the reassurance that they stood above others. Strip away the visible markers of wealth and they would not know who they were. That was their weakness. I saw it clearly now, the structural flaw that Margaret must have identified decades ago. People who need to feel superior cannot tolerate the possibility of being seen as lesser. Challenge their status, question their success, and they will overreact. They will make mistakes. They will reveal themselves. I returned to Margaret's journal that evening, the leather notebook I had found in her study. The torn page still bothered me, a gap in the narrative that felt intentional rather than accidental. I read through the entries again more carefully this time, looking for anything I might have missed. On a page dated 3 years before her death, I found what I was looking for. The handwriting was steady. The words precise, as though Margaret had known someone would read them eventually. If my daughter-in-law ever reads this, she had written, "Know that I met her, and I know." I stared at the sentence, reading it again and again. Margaret had met Melissa. Not at family gatherings, not through Daniel. She had met her separately, privately, in a context significant enough to record in a hidden journal. And whatever happened in that meeting, whatever Margaret learned, she had chosen to document it as a message, a warning, a declaration that she was not fooled. The torn page suddenly made sense. Whatever details Margaret had written about that meeting, she had removed them, perhaps to protect me from knowledge I was not ready for, perhaps to ensure that Melissa could never know exactly what Margaret had discovered. The truth existed somewhere, but Margaret had decided that its time had not yet come. I closed the journal and sat in the darkness of her study thinking about strategy. My instinct was to confront, to demand answers, to force the truth into the open. That was how I had built bridges, by attacking problems, directly applying force where force was needed. But Margaret had taught me a different lesson, one I was only now ready to learn. The proudest enemies defeat themselves. I remembered her saying something similar once, years ago, during a disagreement with a difficult neighbor. She had smiled and told me to wait. Within a month, the neighbor had alienated everyone on the street through his own arrogance. No confrontation required. He had provided all the rope necessary for his own undoing. I made a decision that night. I would stop defending myself. No more arguments with Melissa about her comments. No more attempts to explain my choices to Daniel. No more resistance that they could interpret as strength. Instead, I would appear to weaken. I would seem tired, confused, perhaps even beaten. Let them believe their campaign was succeeding. Let them grow confident, careless, impatient. Meanwhile, Eleanor would prepare the legal counterattack. The trust Margaret had built would remain hidden until the perfect moment. The evidence of Thomas's true motives would be gathered quietly. And when they finally overreached, when their greed pushed them into actions that could not be undone, the trap would close. I picked up the journal one more time and flipped to a page I had overlooked before. Near the back, in handwriting slightly shakier than the rest, Margaret had written a final note. The proudest enemies defeat themselves. You just have to give them enough rope. Then below it, a single line that made my breath catch. Trust yourself, Charles. You are stronger than you know, and I will be with you even when you cannot see me. I understood then what Margaret had been building all those years, not just legal protections or financial fortresses. She had been building me, preparing me for a battle she knew I would have to fight alone. She could not swing the sword for me, but she had made sure I would have one when the time came. I was not going to fight Melissa and Thomas. I was going to let them fall. All I had to do was give them the opportunity to destroy themselves. And based on everything I had seen, that opportunity would come soon enough. The weeks that followed required a performance I had never attempted before. I had spent my career building things, solving problems through direct action, applying logic and force where they were needed. Now I had to become something I was not. Passive, agreeable, defeated. The role felt unnatural, like wearing a suit cut for someone else's body, but Margaret had shown me the way, and I trusted her judgment more than my own instincts. I accepted Melissa's next dinner invitation without hesitation. I arrived on time, brought wine she would quietly judge as inadequate, and sat through 3 hours of conversation in which I was either ignored or patronized. When Thomas made a joke about my truck, I laughed along. When Melissa suggested I might be more comfortable in an assisted living community, I nodded thoughtfully and said I would consider it. When Daniel avoided my eyes across the table, I pretended not to notice. The effect was immediate. Melissa's posture relaxed. Her comments grew bolder, less carefully disguised. Within 2 weeks, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that she'd been telling friends about finally getting the old man under control. She described me as confused, lonely, grateful for their guidance. The narrative she was constructing would make everything easier when the time came to take what she wanted. Thomas visited the cabin on a Saturday afternoon, arriving unannounced in a car that gleamed like a weapon. He said he was in the area checking on a property investment and thought he would stop by to see how I was doing. The lie was transparent, but I welcomed him inside and offered coffee. He accepted with the magnanimity of a king, granting an audience to a peasant. We sat in the living room, Thomas's eyes moving across the modest furnishings with barely concealed disdain. He talked about his latest ventures, a development project in the mountains, a yacht club membership he had recently acquired. But when I asked which marina, he changed the subject. When I inquired about the development's location, he became vague. The details did not add up, but I filed them away without comment. "You know, Charles," he said, eventually settling back in his chair with the comfort of a man who believes he has already won. "I always wondered what Margaret saw in you. She was extraordinary, brilliant, beautiful, capable of anything. She could have had everything." I met his eyes and held them. She did have everything. You just couldn't see it. Something flickered across his face, a crack in the polished surface. For a moment, I saw the young man who had been rejected 50 years ago, still carrying the wound like a splinter beneath the skin. Then the mask returned. He laughed, finished his coffee, and left with promises to visit again soon. Daniel came by the following week alone this time. He seemed nervous from the moment he walked through the door. His movements restless, his conversation circling around topics without landing on any of them. We sat at the kitchen table, and I waited. Sometimes silence is the best invitation. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, can I ask you something?" His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the rehearsed quality it had carried during his last visit. "If you knew someone was doing something wrong but you had no proof, what would you do?" I studied my son's face, the tension around his eyes, the way his hand kept drifting toward his pocket. "I'd find a way to get proof," I said. Daniel fell silent. His fingers touched the outline of his phone through the fabric of his jacket, a gesture so brief I might have imagined it. Then he stood, thanked me for the coffee he had not finished, and left without explaining his question. I watched him drive away and wondered what he was carrying, what evidence he might be gathering, what war was being fought inside him between loyalty and conscience. The boy I raised was still in there somewhere. I had to believe that. The final test came at the end of the month. Melissa called to arrange another meeting, her voice sweet with anticipation. She arrived at the cabin with Daniel in tow, a folder tucked under her arm, her smile radiating the confidence of someone about to close a deal. "Charles," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "We've had our lawyers draw up something simpler, just a power of attorney, nothing dramatic. It lets Daniel handle your affairs if you ever become incapacitated. Standard procedure for someone your age. Everyone does it." I looked at the papers. The language was dense, but the intent was clear. Sign this, and they would have legal authority over everything they believed I owned. The cabin, the accounts, the modest pension they thought represented my entire worth. Melissa held out a pen, her eyes bright with triumph. "It's really just a formality, for your own protection." I took the pen. I held it over the signature line, letting the moment stretch. Melissa leaned forward slightly. Daniel stood frozen by the door. Then I set the pen down unsigned. "I'll need to think about it," I said. Melissa's smile cracked, just slightly, just for an instant, but I saw it, the first fracture in her certainty, the first sign that the trap was beginning to work. Of course, she said, recovering quickly. Take all the time you need. But her voice had changed, and I knew she would not wait long before pushing harder. That was exactly what I was counting on. 3 days passed before Melissa called again. Her voice was tight, controlled, the cheerfulness forced in a way that told me she had been rehearsing. She asked if I had made a decision about the paperwork. I told her I had. She could come by that afternoon to pick up the documents. She arrived within the hour, Daniel trailing behind her like a shadow. I met them at the door and handed Melissa the folder she had left with me. She opened it immediately, flipping to the signature page with the eagerness of someone about to claim a prize. Then she froze. The line was empty, unsigned. I've decided against it, I said calmly. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to transfer authority over my affairs. Melissa's composure shattered like glass dropped on stone. What do you mean you're not ready? Her voice rose, losing the practiced sweetness entirely. This is for your benefit, Charles. We've explained this to you multiple times. Do you not understand what we're trying to do? I understand perfectly, I said. Then why? She stepped closer, the folder crumpling in her grip. Why are you being so stubborn? So ungrateful? We're your family. We're trying to help you, and you're treating us like enemies. Daniel stood by the door, pale and silent. His eyes moved between his wife and me, but he said nothing. I wondered if he was recording this conversation too. Melissa pulled out her phone and made a call. She did not explain who she was calling, but I already knew. Within 40 minutes, Thomas Whitmore's car pulled into my driveway. He emerged with the energy of a man summoned to handle a problem that should have been solved already. He didn't knock. He walked through the door Melissa held open for him and crossed the living room until he stood directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, expensive and aggressive. Charles, he said, all pretense of friendliness abandoned, let me be direct with you. You are an old man living alone in a cabin dependent on your son's goodwill, with no assets worth mentioning and no future worth protecting. The smart thing, the only sensible thing, is to let the people who actually understand money and planning take care of your affairs. I didn't step back. I didn't look away. Who do you think you are? Thomas continued, his voice dropping to something cold and venomous. A man with nothing, living off charity, pretending you have options. Margaret married beneath her. Everyone knew it. She could have had power, influence, a real legacy. Instead, she chose you, a builder of bridges. He spat the words like they were an insult. And now you stand here refusing to do the one thing that might actually help your family. You're not just foolish, Charles. You're selfish. The room was silent. Melissa watched with satisfaction. Daniel stared at the floor. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I spoke, my voice quiet but clear. I am the man Margaret chose, and she never chose wrong. Something shifted in Thomas's face. The anger was still there, but beneath it I saw something else. Uncertainty, a flicker of recognition that the man standing before him was not the defeated fool he had expected. Margaret is dead, Melissa snapped, stepping forward to stand beside her father. She's been dead for 3 years. Whatever she thought, whatever she planned, it doesn't matter anymore. She can't protect you. I looked at her, then at Thomas. Both of them stood rigid with frustration, with the particular fury of people who cannot understand why their script is not being followed. They had expected me to fold. They had planned for weakness, calculated for surrender. They had no strategy for this. Who says she can't? I said. The words landed like a stone in still water. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. Thomas's eyes narrowed, searching my face for meaning he could not find. I did not explain. I did not elaborate. I simply stood there, steady and silent, letting them wonder. This isn't over. Thomas finally said, his voice rough with barely controlled rage. You think you've won something tonight? You've won nothing. You've just made everything harder for yourself. Perhaps, I said, but that's my choice to make. They left without another word. Melissa slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Through the glass, I watched Thomas say something sharp to Daniel before climbing into his car. Daniel stood alone in the driveway for a long moment, looking back at the cabin. Then he too was gone. I sat down in Margaret's chair by the window and let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. The confrontation had cost me something, a reservoir of energy I would need to rebuild. But it had also shown me exactly what I needed to see. Thomas and Melissa had revealed themselves completely, their desperation, their cruelty, their absolute certainty that power belonged to those who grabbed it hardest. They believed they had lost a battle tonight, a skirmish in a war they still expected to win. They would regroup, recalculate, plan their next assault with greater force. What they did not realize was that they had not lost a battle. They had triggered a war that Margaret had been planning for decades, long before any of them knew it existed. Every move they made from this point forward would only tighten the trap she had built. I picked up her journal from the side table and held it in my hands. Tomorrow I would call Eleanor. Tonight I would rest. The hardest part was still ahead, but for the first time since the year-end party, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. I called Eleanor the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the mountains. She answered on the second ring as though she had been waiting. I told her what had happened, the confrontation, Thomas's threats, Melissa's fury. She listened without interruption, then said simply, "It's time." We met at her office that afternoon. The conference room felt different now, charged with purpose rather than revelation. Eleanor sat across from me with a sealed envelope in her hands, cream-colored and worn at the edges as though it had been handled many times over the years. Margaret's handwriting marked the front, "For Charles when he is ready." "She gave this to me 5 years ago," Eleanor said. "Made me promise to keep it sealed until you came to me asking for help, not before. She was very specific about that." She slid the envelope across the table. "I've never read it. Whatever is inside she meant for your eyes only." I held the envelope for a long moment, feeling its weight. 5 years ago, Margaret was still healthy, still sharp, still planning for futures she might never see. She had written this letter knowing I would not read it until after she was gone. The thought pressed against my chest like a hand. I opened it carefully, preserving the paper she had touched. Inside were 2 pages handwritten in her elegant script, the ink slightly faded but every word clear. "My dearest Charles," it began. "If you're reading this, then the fears I've carried have finally arrived at your door. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive. Some truths are too heavy to share until they're needed, and I always hoped this particular truth would never be needed at all." She explained the trust in detail, the assets I had not known about, the investments she had made quietly over decades. But more importantly, she explained the conditions. "This trust is not just about money," she wrote. "It is about character. I have included a moral clause that supersedes all financial provisions. If any beneficiary engages in coercion, financial manipulation, or emotional abuse against you, Charles, their inheritance rights are automatically revoked. Eleanor has the documentation to prove such behavior if it occurs. I have given her broad authority to make that determination." I looked up at Eleanor. She nodded slowly. Margaret anticipated what might happen. She wanted to make sure that anyone who tried to take advantage of you would lose everything instead. I returned to the letter. Near the bottom of the first page, one sentence stood apart from the rest, written with particular care. "If Daniel does the right thing when no one is watching, give him another chance." I read the line 3 times, trying to understand. What was the right thing? What did Margaret expect from our son that she could not explain directly? The clause felt like a test, but I didn't know what was being tested or how Daniel could pass. "Do you know what this means?" I asked Eleanor. She shook her head. "Margaret never explained it to me. She just said that Daniel had a choice to make and that I would know when he made it." She paused. "I've wondered about it for years, but I trust that Margaret knew what she was doing." I set the letter down and rubbed my eyes. Margaret had seen everything: the greed, the manipulation, the slow corruption of our family. She had prepared defenses I was only now discovering, but she had also left mysteries, pieces of a puzzle I could not yet assemble. Eleanor cleared her throat. "There's something else you should know, about Thomas." I looked up. "What he shows the world," she said carefully, "isn't entirely accurate. I've done some research over the years, quietly at Margaret's request. The investments he brags about, the properties, the lifestyle. There are inconsistencies. I can't prove anything yet, but I believe Thomas Whitmore's empire may not be as solid as he wants people to think. The yacht club membership he could not name. The development project with no specific location. The small evasions I had noticed during his visit to the cabin, they were not signs of privacy. They were signs of something else entirely. And there's one more thing," Eleanor continued. Margaret had a secret appointment the week before she died. She wouldn't tell me who she was meeting or why. I offered to accompany her, but she refused. She said it was something she needed to do alone. Did she say anything afterward? Eleanor's expression softened with memory. She came back looking peaceful, not happy exactly, but settled, like she had finished something important. She told me, "Whatever happens now, I've done what I can." I never understood what she meant. I thought of the journal entry. Final meeting. M.W. The initials I still could not place. Margaret had met someone in her final days, someone significant enough to record, but too important to explain. Another piece of the puzzle floating without a frame. I read the letter 3 times more before I left Eleanor's office, memorizing every word, every curve of Margaret's handwriting. She had seen the greed before it arrived. She had anticipated the manipulation before it began. She had built protections I was only now learning to use. But questions remained. What was the right thing Daniel was supposed to do? The clause made no sense, without context, without knowing what choice my son faced when no one was watching. And who had Margaret met in that final week? What had she finished that brought her such peace? The answers were out there, hidden in the spaces between what I knew and what I had yet to discover. Margaret had left me weapons, but she had also left me riddles. And somewhere in those riddles lay the key to everything. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later, printed on the same expensive cardstock Melissa favored for all her events. A dinner party, she called it, a celebration of family. I recognized the language by now, the way she wrapped her schemes in the vocabulary of love and connection. But I accepted anyway. Eleanor had advised me to keep attending, to let them believe their plan was working. The more confident they became, the more they would reveal. The house was filled when I arrived, perhaps 20 guests circulating through the living room and dining area. I recognized a few faces from previous gatherings, friends of Melissa's parents, business associates of Thomas. But there were others too. People I had never met, watching me with expressions that suggested they had already been told stories about who I was and what I represented. Melissa greeted me at the door with exaggerated warmth, her voice carrying across the room. "Charles, I'm so glad you could make it. We were worried you might get lost on the drive over." She laughed as though she had made a joke. Several guests laughed with her. I smiled and said nothing. The evening unfolded with a precision that made its purpose clear. Every conversation seemed to circle back to me, to my age, my living situation, my supposed confusion about modern life. Melissa's friends asked questions designed to highlight my inadequacies. "It must be so hard living alone at your age. Do you still drive? Isn't that dangerous? Melissa mentioned you've been having trouble with your memory lately." I answered each question calmly, giving nothing away. But I understood what was happening. This was not a dinner party. It was a performance carefully staged to establish a narrative. Charles Morgan was old. Charles Morgan was confused. Charles Morgan could not manage his own affairs. If legal action became necessary later, if they needed to challenge my competency or contest my decisions, there would be 20 witnesses ready to confirm what they had seen tonight. The attack escalated after dinner. Melissa stood near the fireplace, glass of wine in hand, and began to address the room as though delivering a toast. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," she said. "Family is so important to us, which is why we've been so concerned about Charles lately." She turned to look at me with practiced sympathy. "He's been struggling since Margaret passed, forgetting appointments, getting confused about finances. We've tried to help, but he's so proud. He won't accept that he needs support." Thomas stepped forward to stand beside his daughter. "Margaret was extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying the same false warmth he had used at the year-end party. "Such a shame she tied herself to someone who could never quite measure up. Poor old Charles, always a step behind, never understanding what he had." He shook his head with theatrical sadness. "Now he's alone, rattling around in that cabin, and he won't even let his own son help him." The room murmured with agreement. Sympathetic glances were exchanged. I sat in my chair and let the words wash over me, cataloging every lie, every exaggeration, every carefully planted seed of doubt. Margaret had warned me about moments like this. The proudest enemies defeat themselves. I just had to wait. I looked at Daniel. My son sat frozen at the edge of the room, his face pale, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. He had not spoken a word in my defense. But his hand was in his pocket, and I could see the tension in his fingers, the small movement of his thumb against something I could not see. He was recording. I was certain of it now. Whatever battle raged inside him, he had chosen his side, even if he could not yet speak it aloud. Melissa was still talking when I stood up. The room fell silent. Every face turned toward me, expecting perhaps a breakdown, a confused protest, something they could add to the evening's narrative. I smoothed my jacket and looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Then I spoke, my voice calm and clear. "Thank you for this evening. It's been educational." I paused, letting the silence stretch. Tomorrow, everything will be different. I walked to the door without hurrying. No one moved to stop me. The confusion on their faces was almost worth the humiliation I'd endured. Behind me, I heard Melissa laugh, the sharp, brittle sound of someone who did not understand what had just happened. "Different," she said to the room. "What's he going to do, call a lawyer?" Thomas's voice carried through the closing door, smug and satisfied. "Let him go. He's already beaten. He just doesn't know it yet." Neither of them noticed Daniel still seated in the corner with his hand trembling in his pocket. Neither of them saw what I saw as I turned for one final glance through the window, the faint red light blinking on the phone pressed against his leg, the recording that captured everything. I drove home through dark mountain roads, my hand steady on the wheel. Tomorrow, I would call Eleanor. Tomorrow, the counterattack would begin. But tonight, I held on to one thought that made the evening's pain bearable. Daniel had made his choice. He was gathering proof just as I had once told him to do. Whatever Margaret meant by the right thing, whatever test she had set for our son, he was passing it in the only way he knew how. Silently, secretly, when no one was watching, except I was watching, and I had never been prouder of him. I called Eleanor before dawn. She answered immediately as though she had not slept either. I told her about the dinner party, the public humiliation, the witnesses being prepared for whatever legal challenge might come. She listened in silence, then said, "They've given us everything we need. I'll be there by 9. She arrived at Daniel's house with 2 associates and a leather briefcase thick with documents. I drove separately, arriving just as their cars pulled into the driveway. The morning sun caught the windows of the house I now knew belonged to Margaret's trust, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. The waiting was over. Melissa opened the door with a smile that faltered only slightly when she saw Eleanor's team. She recovered quickly, her hostess instincts taking over. "Charles, what a surprise! And you've brought guests." Her voice carried the smugness of someone who believed last night's performance had secured her victory. "Please come in. I'll make coffee." We gathered in the living room, the same room where I had been mocked and diminished just hours before. Thomas arrived within minutes, summoned by a text from his daughter. He stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, watching Eleanor with the wariness of a man who recognizes a predator. "I appreciate you seeing us on short notice." Eleanor began, her tone pleasant but precise. "I represent the Margaret Elaine Morgan Revocable Trust, and I'm here to clarify some matters regarding the trust's assets and beneficiaries." Melissa's smile tightened. "I wasn't aware there was a trust. Daniel handles our legal affairs." "Daniel is aware of the trust," Eleanor said. "He's been a named beneficiary since its creation 17 years ago. However, certain conditions of the trust have recently become relevant, and I'm required to ensure all parties understand their positions." She opened the briefcase and removed the first folder. "Let's begin with the company where Daniel serves as CEO, Morgan Architectural Partners." She slid a document across the coffee table. The company was founded with seed capital provided by Margaret Morgan. That capital was structured as a convertible loan, which was later converted to equity. The trust currently holds 62% of the company's shares. The room went still. Daniel, who had been standing near the window, turned to stare at Eleanor. "That's not possible. I built that company myself. The initial investment came from—" He stopped, his face draining of color. "From your parents," Eleanor finished. "From the sale of their first home. What you may not have known is that your mother tracked that investment and structured it to protect the family's interest. You've done excellent work growing the company, Daniel, but the controlling shares have always belonged to the trust, which means they belong to your father." Melissa stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. We've seen the company's shareholder documents. Daniel is the majority owner." "Daniel is the majority owner of the shares he believes he holds," Eleanor said calmly. "The trust's shares are held separately, administered through my office. It's all perfectly legal, and properly documented. She removed a second folder. Now regarding this house. Thomas shifted his weight, his arms uncrossing. I watched him carefully, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes moved toward the door. This property was purchased 7 years ago, shortly before Daniel and Melissa's wedding. The deed is held by the trust with Daniel and Melissa listed as permitted occupants. They have been living here rent-free as a gift from Margaret, but they have never owned this home. Legally, they are tenants. Melissa's composure shattered. She spun toward her father, her voice rising to a pitch I had never heard before. "Dad, you told me he had nothing. You said Margaret married beneath her. You said the old man was living on a pension and charity." Thomas's face had gone pale, the confident mask slipping away to reveal something smaller beneath. He opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time since I had known him, Thomas Whitmore had nothing to say. "I don't understand," Daniel said quietly, his voice hollow. "Mom never told me any of this. Why would she hide it?" I spoke for the first time since entering the room, because she wanted to see who you would become without knowing. Wealth reveals character, Daniel. She wanted yours to develop honestly. Eleanor allowed the silence to settle before reaching into her briefcase one final time. She removed a thin folder different from the others and placed it on the table with deliberate care. "There's one more matter we need to address," she said. "And now let's discuss what Mr. Whitmore has been hiding from his own daughter." Thomas took a step backward. His hand reached for the mantel, steadying himself against something that was not physical. Melissa stared at her father, then at the folder, then back at her father. "What is she talking about, Dad? What is she talking about?" Thomas did not answer, but I saw the answer in his eyes. The sudden fear of a man whose carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Whatever secrets he had kept, whatever lies he had built his empire upon, they were about to be exposed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eleanor opened the folder with the precision of a surgeon beginning an operation. Inside were court documents, financial records, bank statements, a paper trail that told a story Thomas Whitmore had spent 5 years trying to bury. She spread them across the coffee table methodically, each page another nail in a coffin of lies. 5 years ago. Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. Thomas Whitmore filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in the state of Nevada. The filing was made through a shell company to minimize public exposure, but the records exist for anyone willing to look carefully enough. She tapped the first document. Total declared debts $4.7 million. Assets virtually none. The bankruptcy was discharged 18 months later, but Mr. Whitmore's financial situation has not meaningfully recovered. The room was silent. Melissa stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the papers as though they might rearrange themselves into something she could understand. "The mansion where you host your holiday parties," Eleanor continued, "is a rental property. The lease is paid quarterly, often late, through a series of rotating credit accounts. The luxury vehicles Mr. Tister Whitmore drives are leased through a company that specializes in providing appearances of wealth to clients who can no longer afford the reality. The yacht club membership he mentions so frequently does not exist. There is no yacht. There never was." Thomas had not moved from his position near the fireplace, but he seemed smaller now, diminished, as though the exposure of his lies had physically reduced him. His face was the color of old paper. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I don't know where you got these documents, but they're clearly fabricated. I'll have my lawyers—" "Your lawyers have been paid with borrowed money for the past 3 years," Eleanor interrupted calmly. "2 of them have already filed liens against you for unpaid fees. I have those documents as well if you'd like to review them." Melissa turned to her father slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to something darker. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me she's lying." Thomas could not meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, at the walls, at anything except his daughter's face. "The timeline is important," Eleanor continued. "Mr. Whitmore's bankruptcy was filed approximately 6 months before Melissa began dating Daniel. At that point, Thomas was desperate. He needed access to capital, to connections, to anything that could help him maintain the illusion he had built. And then his daughter started seeing the son of Margaret Morgan. I watched understanding dawn on Melissa's face, slow and terrible, like a sunrise revealing wreckage. Margaret Morgan, Eleanor said, whom Thomas had pursued 50 years earlier, whom he had never forgotten. He knew the family had resources even if he didn't know the extent, and he saw an opportunity. "No," Melissa said, shaking her head. "No, that's not what happened. I met Daniel at a conference. It was coincidence. Dad had nothing to do with it." "The conference was sponsored by a company your father secretly invested in," Eleanor replied. "The seating arrangements placed you next to Daniel Morgan specifically. Your father orchestrated the meeting. I have emails confirming his involvement." She produced another document, this one a printed email chain. Melissa grabbed it, her hands trembling as she read. The color drained from her face with each line. "You planned this," she said, turning to Thomas. Her voice had changed, stripped of its practiced smoothness, raw with betrayal. "You told me Daniel was a good investment. You said his family had potential. You taught me to evaluate marriage like a business deal." She threw the papers at him, her composure finally shattered. "Everything you taught me about investing in marriage, about not letting emotions cloud my judgment, it was because you needed the money. You used me, your own daughter. You used me to save yourself." Thomas finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of shame and defiance. "I was trying to protect us both. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The people I owed money to, the threats, the... Protect us." Melissa's voice rose to a scream. "You sold me. You positioned me like inventory. Every piece of advice you ever gave me was about making sure I could access their money for you." I stood near the doorway watching the confrontation unfold. Part of me felt something close to satisfaction, but it was tempered by the wreckage on display. Thomas had not just deceived me and Margaret. He had deceived his own daughter, shaped her into an instrument of his greed, and let her believe she was the architect of her own schemes. Eleanor mentioned Margaret's name again, referencing the trust documents, and I saw something flicker across Melissa's face. A flinch. Small, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. It was not the reaction of someone hearing a stranger's name. It was guilt, fear, the response of someone carrying a secret they desperately wanted to keep hidden. I filed the observation away, adding it to the growing list of questions I could not yet answer. "You told me Margaret chose the wrong man," I said quietly, stepping forward. The room fell silent. Thomas and Melissa both turned to look at me, their private war momentarily suspended. "You said she could have had everything, that she married beneath her." I looked around the room slowly, at Eleanor, steady and professional, surrounded by evidence of decades of preparation. At Daniel, pale and shaken, but still standing, processing revelations that would take months to fully understand. At Melissa, her carefully constructed identity crumbling around her. At Thomas, exposed at last as the fraud he had always been. "Look around this room," I said. "Look at who is standing and who is falling. Margaret never chose wrong. She saw exactly who you were 50 years ago, and she was right. She built something real while you built illusions, and now those illusions are gone." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his life, perhaps he had nothing left to say. Melissa screamed at her father, then a sound of pure rage and betrayal that echoed through the house. "You ruined my life for your debts. Everything I did, everything I became, it was all for nothing, for your lies." She collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing, her fury exhausted. Thomas stood alone by the fireplace, isolated, diminished. The Emperor finally revealed to have no clothes, but I was not watching their confrontation. I was watching Melissa's face during the moments when she thought no one was looking. The guilt that surfaced when Margaret's name was mentioned. The fear that seemed older and deeper than today's revelations could explain. She knew something. Something about Margaret, something she had kept hidden even as she executed her father's plans. I remembered the journal entry, "Final meeting, M.W." I remembered Eleanor saying Margaret had a secret appointment the week before she died. I remembered the peace on my wife's face when she returned from that meeting. M.W. Melissa Whitmore. The thought struck me like lightning. Margaret had met Melissa, before she died, alone. And whatever happened in that meeting, Melissa had never told anyone. What did my wife say to my daughter-in-law in her final days? What truth had she delivered that still made Melissa flinch at the sound of her name 3 years later? I did not know yet. But I was going to find out. The house emptied slowly. Eleanor and her team gathered their documents, speaking in low voices about next steps and legal timelines. Thomas left without a word, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor with none of their usual confidence. Melissa had retreated upstairs, her sobs still audible through the ceiling. I stood by the window watching the cars pull away one by one, feeling the strange stillness that follows an earthquake. Daniel had not moved from his corner of the room. He stood with his back against the wall, arms wrapped around himself like a man trying to hold himself together. When the last car disappeared down the driveway, he finally spoke. "Dad." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Can we talk, just us?" I nodded. We moved to the kitchen, away from the destruction in the living room. Daniel sat at the table, the same table where he had presented me with those transfer documents weeks ago. Now, he looked like a different person, smaller somehow, stripped of the performance he had been maintaining for years. His hands were shaking. He placed them flat on the table, trying to steady them, but the tremor continued. He looked like a man about to confess a crime, or perhaps to reveal a secret he had carried far too long. "I need to show you something," he said. "Here. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the same phone I had seen him touch so many times during family gatherings, during arguments, during the dinner party where I was humiliated in front of strangers. He placed it on the table between us and opened an app I did not recognize. The screen filled with audio files, rows of them dated and time-stamped stretching back months. I counted as he scrolled. Dozens, scores, more than 100 recordings, each one labeled with a date and brief description. 127. Daniel said quietly. 18 months of conversations. Every time Melissa talked about you, about the money, about her plans. Every time Thomas called to give her instructions. Every insult. Every manipulation. Every scheme. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. I recorded all of it. I stared at the phone, trying to process what I was seeing. 18 months. My son had been gathering evidence for 18 months, sitting silently through humiliations, while his thumb pressed record, documenting the very betrayals I thought he was participating in. I didn't know what to do. Daniel continued, the words coming faster now, tumbling over each other like water breaking through a dam. When I first realized what Melissa was really after, I wanted to confront her. I wanted to protect you. But then I thought about everything I could lose. My job, the company I thought I built, the kids. If I accused her without proof, she would have destroyed me. And Thomas, he has connections, lawyers. I knew if I moved too soon, they would find a way to bury it. He ran his hands through his hair, the gesture achingly familiar from his childhood, from every moment of stress or confusion he had ever faced. So I started recording. Every conversation I could. I told myself I was building a case, but honestly, Dad, I was just scared. I didn't know what to do with any of it. I didn't know who to trust. He paused, swallowing hard. 3 months ago, I found Eleanor's name in some old papers of Mom's. I called her. I didn't even know if she would talk to me, but she did, and I sent her everything. I looked at Eleanor's business card still sitting on the kitchen counter from her visit. She had known. For 3 months she had known about Daniel's recordings, and she had kept that secret too, waiting for the right moment. "The evidence you gathered," I said slowly. "It activated the trust's moral clause, the documentation of coercion and manipulation. That's what Eleanor needed to invoke the protections your mother built." Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face now. "Mom's letter. The line about doing the right thing when no one is watching. Eleanor explained it to me. Mom knew I might be tested. She knew I might have to choose between standing up publicly and gathering proof quietly. She left room for both. If Daniel does the right thing when no one is watching, give him another chance. Margaret had known our son better than I had. She had anticipated his fear, his paralysis, his desperate need to find proof before he could act. And she had written a clause into her trust that honored that path, that recognized courage can be quiet as well as loud. I stood and walked around the table. Daniel looked up at me with the expression of a child awaiting judgment, uncertain whether forgiveness was possible. I reached down and pulled him to his feet, then wrapped my arms around him. He broke. The sobs came from somewhere deep, years of guilt and fear and silence pouring out against my shoulder. I held him the way I had held him when he was small, when nightmares woke him, and only a father's presence could restore safety. "I thought you'd never forgive me," he managed between breaths. "I sat there while they insulted you. I let them treat you like nothing. I was too scared to speak up." "You weren't silent," I said, my own voice rough with emotion. "You were waiting. You were gathering what we needed. Your mother knew you would find a way, Daniel. She always believed in you." We stood there for a long time, two men learning how to be father and son again. When Daniel finally pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve, something had shifted between us. The distance of years had not disappeared, but a bridge had been built across it. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, his voice steadier now but still carrying weight. "Last night after you left the dinner party, after everyone was gone, Melissa was drunk, angry, falling apart. She said something I didn't understand at the time." I waited, feeling the air in the room grow heavy. "She said Mom came to see her, a week before Mom died." Daniel's eyes met mine. "She said they had a meeting, just the two of them, and whatever Mom said to her, it's been haunting her ever since." The journal entry. "Final meeting, MW," the initials I had puzzled over for weeks. Margaret had met Melissa. My dying wife had sought out my daughter-in-law and delivered a message important enough to record. Important enough to tear from her journal, important enough to leave Melissa flinching at her name 3 years later. "Did she say what they talked about?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "She wouldn't tell me, but Dad, the way she looked when she said it, she was terrified. Not of you, not of the trust, not of losing the money. She was terrified of whatever Mom said to her in that meeting." The days that followed were quiet, in the way that aftermath is quiet, the silence after a storm when the damage is still being assessed. News travels quickly in certain circles, and the revelations about Thomas Whitmore spread through his social network like fire through dry grass. The man who had boasted about yacht clubs and property developments was exposed as a fraud, and the community that had once celebrated him now pretended they had never known him at all. Melissa suffered the same fate. The friends who had laughed at her jokes about her confused father-in-law stopped returning her calls. The women who had attended her dinner parties suddenly had scheduling conflicts that prevented any future gatherings. The social architecture she had spent 7 years constructing collapsed overnight, leaving her isolated in a house that was not hers, surrounded by furniture she could not keep, facing a future she had never prepared for. I was present when Daniel went to speak with her 3 days after Eleanor's visit. He had asked me to come, not to intervene, but to witness. I think he needed someone to hold him accountable, to ensure he said what needed to be said without cruelty or weakness. We found Melissa in the living room, sitting in the same chair where she had once presided over gatherings designed to diminish me. She looked smaller now, her makeup absent, her hair uncombed, the armor of her appearance finally set aside. When we entered, she did not stand. She barely looked up. Daniel sat across from her. I remained near the doorway, close enough to hear, but far enough to give them space. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Daniel began, his voice steady but not cold. "For us, for the kids, for whatever future we might have." Melissa laughed, a short, bitter sound. "What future? Your father owns everything. The house, the company, probably the clothes on my back. What future could we possibly have?" "That's not true," Daniel said. "Dad isn't trying to destroy you. Neither am I. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't live in a marriage built on lies and manipulation." He paused, gathering himself. "I'm offering you a choice. A real choice, not an ultimatum." She looked at him, then, something flickering in her eyes that might have been hope or might have been suspicion. "We can divorce," Daniel continued. "You walk away, start over somewhere else, build a life that's actually yours. Or we can try to fix this. Family therapy, honesty, a complete reconstruction of what we are to each other. I loved you once, Melissa. Maybe I still do. But I can't live in a lie anymore. The choice is yours." The room was silent. I watched Melissa's face as she processed the offer, saw the calculations running behind her eyes. For a moment I thought she might choose transformation. There was something in her expression that looked almost like longing, a glimpse of the woman she might have been if Thomas had raised her differently. But then the mask returned. The pride that had been her armor and her prison reasserted itself, straightening her spine, hardening her features. "Therapy," she said flatly. "You want me to sit in a room and talk about my feelings, admit that everything I believed was wrong, become some humble, grateful wife who thanks you for giving her a second chance?" She shook her head. "I can't do that, Daniel. I don't know how to be that person. I'm not sure I want to." Daniel nodded slowly, as though he had expected this answer. "Then I'll have the papers drawn up. You can have time to find somewhere to stay. I won't rush you." Melissa stood smoothing her wrinkled clothes with hands that trembled slightly. She walked toward the door, then stopped. When she turned back, her expression had changed. The pride was still there, but beneath it was something raw, something that had been waiting to surface. "You think your mother was so perfect?" she said, her voice dropping. "So wise. Everyone talks about Margaret like she was a saint, But she wasn't protecting Charles from me. She was punishing me because she knew. I stepped forward, my heart suddenly pounding. Knew what? Melissa's eyes met mine, and I saw fear there. The same guilty fear I had noticed when Margaret's name was mentioned. Your wife came to see me 1 week before she died. She knew everything I would do, everything I was planning, and she let me do it anyway. The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean she met you? Margaret never mentioned. Melissa's laugh was hollow, broken the sound of someone who had carried a weight too long. Of course she didn't, because what she said to me wasn't a warning. It wasn't advice. It was a sentence. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. She told me I would fail. She told me I would lose everything, and she told me that when it happened I would know it was my own fault, not hers, not yours, not anyone else's, just mine. She turned to face me, fully tears streaming down her cheeks. She said she wasn't going to stop me because she believed in you. She said you would survive whatever I did, and that watching you survive would be my punishment. Every day for 3 years I've heard her voice in my head. Every scheme, every insult, every plan, and she was right, about all of it. I stood frozen, unable to speak. That's what your perfect wife did to me, Charles. She looked into my soul and told me exactly what I would become. And then she let me become it, knowing I would destroy myself in the process. Melissa walked out the door without looking back, but her words remained hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. I found Melissa in her car, still parked in the driveway. She had not driven away. She sat behind the wheel with her hands in her lap, staring at nothing. When I approached the window, she did not seem surprised. Perhaps she had been waiting for me to come, knowing that her confession had been incomplete, that the full truth still needed to be spoken. I opened the passenger door and sat beside her. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The afternoon light filtered through the windshield, casting shadows across her face that made her look older, more fragile than I had ever seen her. Tell me about the meeting, I said quietly. All of it. Melissa closed her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was distant, as though she were recounting a dream she could not escape. She called me herself, 1 week before she died. I didn't even know she had my number. She asked me to meet her at a cafe in town, a small place near the bookstore. She said it was important, and she said to come alone. Melissa's hands tightened in her lap. I almost didn't go. I thought it might be a trap, some kind of confrontation, but I was curious. I wanted to see what the great Margaret Morgan had to say to me. She opened her eyes, staring through the windshield at memories I could not see. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked sick, thinner than I remembered, but her eyes were sharp, so sharp. She watched me walk across the room like she was reading every thought in my head. I listened without interrupting, my chest tight with the weight of what I was hearing. She didn't waste time with small talk. She just looked at me and said, I know who you are. I know what you'll do to my family after I'm gone. I know about your father's debts, your plans for my son, your contempt for my husband. I know everything. Melissa's voice cracked. I expected threats. I expected her to tell me she would expose me, ruin me, turn Daniel against me. I had already prepared my defenses, but she didn't threaten me. What did she say? She said, I'm not going to stop you. Melissa turned to look at me, her eyes haunted. I didn't understand. I asked her what she meant, and she smiled this terrible, peaceful smile, and she said, I won't stop you because I believe in Charles. He'll survive whatever you do. He'll be stronger for it. He doesn't need me to protect him from someone like you. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward through everything I thought I knew about my wife. Then she said something I've never been able to forget. Melissa's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But you, Melissa, you'll have to live with yourself. Every victory will taste like ash. Every scheme will feel hollow, because you'll know that I saw through you completely, and I still chose not to fight. That's not mercy. That's judgment. I sat in silence, feeling the shape of Margaret's final act of love and warfare. She finished her tea, Melissa continued, and she stood up and she said, When you lose everything, and you will remember that I gave you a chance to walk away today, you could have chosen differently, but you won't. I know you won't, and that knowledge will be your punishment long after I'm gone. Melissa broke down, then sobbing against the steering wheel. She was right, about all of it. Every time I humiliated Charles, I heard her voice. Every time I thought I was winning, I remembered that smile. She poisoned every triumph before I even achieved it. I didn't lose to you, Charles. I didn't lose to Eleanor or the trust or Daniel's recordings. I lost to a dead woman who knew me better than I knew myself. I stepped out of the car without speaking. There was nothing I could say that would matter to Melissa now. Her defeat was complete, not because of what had been taken from her, but because of what Margaret had shown her about herself. I walked back to the house, then past it following the path that led to the small garden Margaret had planted years ago. The winter had stripped it bare, but the structure remained the careful arrangement of stones and borders that she had designed to last through any season. Her photograph sat on my nightstand in the cabin, but I didn't need to see it to feel her presence. She had been here all along, woven into every document Eleanor held, every recording Daniel made, every trap that closed around the people who tried to destroy what we had built. I returned to her study that evening and pulled her favorite book from the shelf. A worn copy of poetry she had read so many times the spine had cracked. As I opened it, a folded page fell into my hands, the torn page from her journal, the one I had wondered about for weeks. She had hidden it here, knowing I would find it when I was ready. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Her handwriting filled the page steady and clear despite the illness that must have been consuming her when she wrote it. I don't protect him from storms. I teach him to stand in them. That's not love as weakness, that's love as faith. Charles will face what comes after I'm gone, and he will rise. Not because I shielded him, but because I believed in him enough to let him fight his own battles. That is my final gift. Not protection. Trust. I held the page against my chest and let the tears come. She had known everything. She had prepared everything. And in the end, she had trusted me to become the man she always believed I could be. That was Margaret. That was love. And I would carry it with me for whatever time I had left. Thomas came to the cabin on a gray morning in early spring. I saw his car approach through the window and felt no anxiety, no anger, only a calm readiness for whatever final words remained between us. He knocked on the door like a visitor rather than an invader, and I let him in. He looked older than he had just weeks before, the collapse of his carefully constructed world visible in the slump of his shoulders and the hollows beneath his eyes. He stood in my living room, surrounded by the modest furnishings he had once mocked, and seemed uncertain how to begin. "I came to explain," he said finally, "to help you understand why I did what I did." I gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing as though comfort was something he no longer deserved. 50 years ago, Margaret was everything I wanted," he continued. "Beautiful, intelligent, from a good family. When she refused me, I couldn't accept it. I told myself she had made a mistake, that she would realize it eventually, but she never did. She chose you, and she never looked back." "And you never moved on," I said. "I tried. 3 marriages. None of them were her." His voice cracked slightly. "When Melissa started dating your son, I saw an opportunity. Not just for money, though I needed that too. I wanted to prove that Margaret had been wrong, that the life she chose with you was worth less than what I could have given her." I looked at him. This man who had spent half a century nursing a wound that existed only in his own mind. "You spent 50 years hating a woman because she saw who you really were. That's not heartbreak, Thomas. That's obsession. An obsession is a prison you built yourself." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For once in his life, Thomas Whitmore had nothing to say. He turned and walked out the door without another word. I watched his car disappear down the driveway and felt nothing but a quiet release, the lifting of a weight I had not realized I was carrying. Daniel came by that afternoon. He had been making changes in the weeks since the truth emerged, stepping back from his role at the company, spending time with his children, learning to be present in ways his ambition had never allowed. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and told me about his plans. "I'm going to start over," he said. "Learn the business from the ground up. No shortcuts, no family money as a crutch. I want to build something that's actually mine." I nodded, proud of the man he was choosing to become. "That sounds right." He was quiet for a moment, staring into his cup. "Dad, can you ever forgive me for staying silent so long, for letting them treat you the way they did?" I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. "You don't need forgiveness, Daniel. You need time to forgive yourself. That's harder, but it's more important." Melissa signed the divorce papers the following week. I was there when she came to collect the last of her belongings, boxes of clothes and personal items that represented the remnants of a life built on false foundations. She moved efficiently without tears, the armor of her pride restored enough to carry her through this final departure. At the door, she paused. "I suppose you're enjoying this," she said. "No," I replied honestly. "Margaret didn't want revenge. She wanted truth. Now you have it. What you do with it is your choice." She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Then she walked out without another word, climbing into a rented car and driving away from the life she had tried to steal. That evening, I sat alone at the lakeside cabin Margaret had loved. The water was still reflecting the last light of sunset. I held her final letter in my hands, reading it one more time, letting her words settle into my bones. "I never protected you from storms, Charles. I only taught you how to stand in them. That's what love is, not shelter, but faith." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where I kept her photographs, her jewelry, the small treasures of a life shared. The cabin was quiet around me, but it no longer felt empty. It felt complete. I thought about the year-end party where this had all begun, the laughter, the mockery, the certainty in their eyes that I was nothing worth considering. They had measured me by their own standards and found me lacking. They had looked at my truck, my cabin, my quiet life and seen only absence. They laughed because they thought I had nothing. But Margaret taught me the truth. Real wealth is not what you own. It is knowing who you are when everyone else forgets. They were wrong about me. They were wrong about her. And in the end, they were wrong about everything that matters. And that was my story. A story about patience, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise. I spent months being laughed at, dismissed, and humiliated by people who measured worth in dollar signs and square footage. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my calm was confusion. They never imagined that behind my patience stood a woman who had seen them coming decades before they arrived. Margaret taught me that true victory is not about destroying your enemies. It is about standing so firmly in your own truth that their lies collapse under their own weight. She did not shield me from the storm. She trusted me to weather it. And in the end, that trust was the greatest gift she ever gave me. Thomas lost everything because he could not let go of a rejection from 50 years ago. Melissa lost everything because she built her life on her father's lies. And Daniel found his way back because somewhere inside him, the son I raised still remembered what mattered. If this story touched you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have known better? Have you ever had to stand alone against those who thought they could break you? Share your experiences in the comments below. Tell me which moment in this story stayed with you the most, and let me know where you are watching from today. If you believe that quiet strength can still win in a loud world, subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us why dignity, patience, and faith in ourselves will always be more valuable than the approval of those who never truly see us.